I'd like to welcome you all to the inaugural talk of the seminar series titled Global Governance in the Digital Era of GLODEM. Today, we actually embark on a journey of exploration and insight, a journey that will take us to the intersection of technology, policy, and society. And we have the great pleasure of virtually hosting Elina Noor for the debut, whom I will introduce to you all in a bit. Just briefly on our newly launching seminar series, our focus throughout the series will be on the subtle and often overlooked strands of what we could say that wave actually the larger picture strands of data stewardship, algorithmic fairness, and environmental footprint of growing digital economies. And as you all know, we actually stand at a critical juncture where the decisions that we make and the policies that we craft will ripple across societies and ecosystems. And as steward of this digital era, I believe that it is really our responsibility to ensure that technology serves as a bridge, not as a barrier, to a more equitable and sustainable future, which is why we've decided to start the seminar series. Our esteemed speakers, leading experts in their fields, will be shedding light on these pressing concerns and guide our discourse accordingly. And through this series, we aim to, in a way, foster a dialogue that is as diverse and inclusive as the regions that we'll be discussing, a dialogue that resonates really with the voices of all stakeholders. So in a nutshell, I actually invite you all to engage, to debate, and to collaborate as we delve into the intricacies of global governance in the digital era. And I very much look forward to a series of stimulating and enlightening conversations. Without further ado, let me briefly introduce our esteemed speaker, Elina Noor, to you. Elina is a senior fellow in the Asia program at Carnegie, where she focuses on developments in Southeast Asia, particularly the impact and implications of technology in reshaping power dynamics, governance, and nation building in the region. Previously, Elina was the Director of Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Prior to that, Elina was an associate professor at the Daniel H. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu. I hope I'm not butchering all these names, but if I did, well, it's on me. She spent most of her career at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Malaysia, where she last held the position of Director of Foreign Policy and Security Studies. Elina was also formerly with the Brookings Institution's project on U.S. relations with the Islamic world, and between 2017 and 19, she was a member of the Global Commission on the Sustainability of Cyberspace. She currently serves on the RCRC's Global Advisory Board on Digital Threats During Conflict. And she read law at the University of Oxford. She obtained an LLM from the London School of Economics and Political Science, University of London, graduating with distinction at the top of her class, a recipient of the Perdana Fellowship, which is Malaysian Prime Minister's Fellowship. She also holds an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University, where she was a Women in International Security scholar. As you see, it took me a while to even briefly introduce her to you. It is a great pleasure to have the debut with Elina. I'm so happy to have her with us today. Elina, welcome again to our virtual seminar, and thank you so much for being with us today, despite this awful flu you're recovering from. So without further ado, shall we start with my first question? I do have a couple of questions in mind, but As I may have mentioned to our audience, our aim is to actually foster not necessarily a very formal dialogue, but to have an engaging discussion on the issues that I've just mentioned. So what we're going to do is I will be asking a few questions to Elina that I had in mind, and then we will open the floor for a Q&A. So let's start with the questions I had in mind regarding the data stewardship. In the context of Southeast Asia, how can we establish a framework for data stewardship that ensures both the protection of individual rights and the fostering of innovation? And again, on top of that, maybe we can also speak about what are the unique challenges that Southeast Asian countries face in terms of data governance, and how do they compare with global standards? I'll pause here. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Mary, for having me on here. It's such a joy to see you and to be chatting with you on a topic that's important to both of us. And I'm really thrilled to be doing this with you. I should add for your audience that I've been trying to learn Turkish. And so this is my 1-year-old, Günaydın from Washington, D.C. But I do have a few other Turkish words that are in my vocabulary. So let me get to your question. I think we in Southeast Asia have almost locked ourselves into this debate between individual rights of data, referring to privacy and data protection on the one hand, and innovation on the other. And sometimes these two converge. But I wish that my region, I'm from Malaysia, would look a little more broadly about data stewardship issues. Look further down south, for example, to New Zealand, where there is such a thing as collective data governance, particularly among the Maori community. Because we assume that a lot of our data structures are going to have to be premised on our international engagement in trade and economic affairs, which is true. And so what you see is countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, we've all built our frameworks around the GDPR, for example. But even GDPR experts have told me that GDPR is not necessarily the gold standard for all countries, not even some in Europe, is what I've been told. What more for very diverse region and very diverse countries within the diverse region of Southeast Asia. And so when we think about data protection and data privacy, I think in Southeast Asia, we need to be going beyond just individual rights to think about even community data protection, because a lot of the data these days, as you know, Mary, very well, is being anonymized and collected on a mass scale. How do you account for even individual data rights on that level? So for a number of reasons, including the fact that we have indigenous communities in our countries in Southeast Asia that may center their idea of protection of data protection of culture, of language, of other cultural rights around the community rather than the individual. Also for the reason that this data anonymization is becoming more of a norm in the era of big data, we in Southeast Asia need to be thinking more along the lines of, are there other frameworks beyond just individual data rights and protection that we need to look at, primarily, for example, collective data and collective data governance and data stewardship. Now, I don't think this is true and has been made a reality at the global level. And if we're talking about technology being used to redress inequities, to further equities and justice, we need to move beyond this idea of rights and innovation and look a little bit broader about what data means to communities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And maybe just moving on to algorithmic biases, because that's what we've been discussing, I guess, also. I forgot to mention, for those of you who don't know either of us, actually, We founded an initiative together with Elina and other colleagues that was incubated by the Paris Peace Forum a couple of years ago, actually. It's called Initiate. It's a digital rights initiative, basically. And algorithmic bias was actually at the very core of our working group that presented its findings the past Paris Peace Forum, not this one, but the previous one. This one is actually still coming up, I guess, right? So that's why the algorithmic bias topic is I guess very much speaking to all those debates that we had there. But in particularly in the case of Southeast Asia, could you speak about what kind of measures you believe can Southeast Asian tech companies take to prevent the embedding of cultural and social biases in their algorithms? It's kind of a general, of course, question, but if you had any examples that you had in mind from the region where algorithmic decision making has had significant social impacts, and how can these countries then address these potential biases, that'd be interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a little difficult to answer that question because a lot of the data on algorithms are proprietary, of course, because the tech companies are commercial enterprises, and it's unclear how much of their algorithms, how their algorithms are being trained, are transparent. And so I think that's one call, that we need greater transparency and therefore accountability. Where are they getting their data sets from? How are their algorithms being trained? How much of this data is local or localized? And if it is localized, what are the protections that were afforded to collect that data, for example? So a lot of unknowns in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of data optimism, a lot of excitement in Southeast Asia about everything related to tech, right? And there's almost a techno-deterministic approach to tech, that we are on this road, we're on this race to get to somewhere with tech, but we're not quite sure what the road looks like. And if you look at the policy frameworks of a number of countries in Southeast Asia, you'll see references to equity and fairness and all these really wonderful terms that we see in even international documents. But what that translates to on the ground is still very unclear, because again, if you look deeper at some of the AI guidelines, for example, that are being drawn up in Southeast Asia, my country included, Malaysia, you'll see that a lot of the terms are borrowed from abroad, from the West. You know, you have things like a quadruple helix structure, for example. How does that even translate? You and I, of course, may understand what it means, although admittedly, I had trouble understanding what it meant when I first read it. But how does that even translate to the person on the ground when you try to explain that a quadruple helix structure means the inclusion of business, of the public sector, of civil society, of academia, when it comes to trying to understand AI algorithms better and creating a more ethical AI framework? Because a lot of these terms are borrowed, they're not necessarily organically understood. And so when we think about some of these biases, we have to wonder in Southeast Asia, particularly given our, again, our cultural diversity, what it really means and how it translates to on the ground. Now, I will give you one example, again, from my country, Malaysia, where the criminal justice system in one particular state in Malaysia has elected to enroll the help of AI to help judges make decisions in criminal cases. And so the AI algorithms recommend sentencing. They don't recommend decisions, but they recommend sentencing. And the idea is supposed to speed up the whole process, to reduce backlog in the judicial system. But I think the concern is, because it's been laid out in the criminal courts, and therefore you have cases like drug offenses, like rape even, being a part of this AI supported sentencing system, then it raises a lot of questions and concerns. And indeed, the Bar Association in Malaysia has raised some questions about the data set that is being used to train these algorithms. The data set for rape, if I'm not mistaken, that's used, it only goes 5 years back. And so the Bar Association has said it's not enough. It's not enough to just have 5 years worth of cases in order to recommend sentencing. Now, again, the final decision on sentencing is up to the judges, but the fact that it's being rolled out in criminal cases as opposed to just civil cases is, I think, a bit of an eyebrow-raising kind of phenomenon in Southeast Asia, and particularly in Malaysia.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can also go back to the issue of algorithmic biases later, because again, that's one of the rather maybe popular topics that our audience is also more familiar with. But the environmental impact of AI is absolutely one of the most important and pressing, actually, needs that we need to discuss. So my question then is going to be on, as we see in the case of Southeast Asia, just rapidly advancing in AI and high tech overall, what steps you believe should be taken to mitigate the environmental footprint of data centers and tech infrastructure, or what steps have been taken, or what is your view overall? Whether it's, I tend to be a cautiously optimistic person, very cautiously optimistic person when it comes to things of this sort. But how can Southeast Asian countries balance their digital economic growth with sustainable environmental policies? If you could speak about your experience so far.
Cautious optimism is a step up from my cynicism, Mary. So well done to you. So going back to my earlier comment about techno-optimism in Southeast Asia, when you read these reports that are produced by, for example, consultancies, again, there's a lot of bullishness about the number of data centers that are expected to be built. And in fact, Southeast Asian countries are competing to be the regional data center hub. So, for example, a number that has been thrown around has been, there is expected to be 20,000 data centers built in Southeast Asia by 2027. Yeah, it's crazy when you think about it, right? But there are policies that are being laid out in order to facilitate that investment. And a lot of these initiatives are being thought of in terms of the investment draw, as well as the number of jobs that are expected to be created. So everything is thought of in terms of economic growth and GDP. And I think in Southeast Asia, we haven't really stepped back to think about what all that growth is really going to amount to. Is it growth for the sake of growth, or is it growth for the sake of, again, redressing inequities, mitigating injustice? What is the aim of this growth? And that's a question, almost a philosophical question, but a deeply fundamental one that we haven't begun to ask ourselves in Southeast Asia. Like I said, we're on this race to somewhere, but we haven't understood what that end of the journey looks like. Now, with data centers, there's been an effort to make them more green. So a lot of data centers, for example, have built in kind of these ecologically friendly measures, and they talk about a reduction in energy consumption, because it uses, as you know, quite a bit of energy, and energy has to be diverted in order to run those data centers. And I think the data centers that are in Singapore use something like 14% of Singapore's total energy consumption, which is quite a bit for a small island republic. But when we think of data centers, we often only think of one portion of the energy consumption of data centers, right? So we think of it in terms of its operations. How much energy consumption is being used? How much greenhouse gases are being released? First of all, we don't really think about the start of the cycle of building data centers and the end life cycle of those data centers. We only focus on the operations bit. all the materials, resources that are needed to even build those data centers, the resources that need to be extracted from the ground or wherever else in order to construct those data centers to begin with, the transportation that needs to be called in to logistically facilitate the building of those data centers, getting the resources from point A to point B, for example, how much energy is being used there, how much GHG is being released there. But what about kind of the labor costs and the cost to the health of communities from those resource extraction activities in order to build those data centers? So that's kind of the production manufacturing side of the equation. Then we get to the operations, which is fairly well documented these days. And then what happens to these data centers at the end of their life cycle? Again, very little data on this because data centers are a fairly new phenomenon. But how we run them down, whether we choose to shut them down or not, and what happens to the component parts that make up those data centers, the insides of those data centers, where do they go? How are they being recycled, or are they just being tossed into landfills? Those are questions that are still unaddressed, particularly in Southeast Asia, but I think globally as well. And so I would urge us to think of the green effects of AI or data centers in its total life cycle.
Thank you so much, Elina. Another question I had in mind is actually regarding the public perception, because that's, I guess, one of the topics that's often overlooked, not only in the case of course, AI biases or environmental impacts, but the future of digitalization and all. How does public sentiment in Southeast Asia regarding, again, environmental impacts of AI and tech infrastructure align with, you believe, government and industry actions? And what role can it play, you believe, in shaping a sustainable digital policy that reflects the ecological values of the region?
Honestly, I think there's still a very narrow conception of the environmental impact and effects of AI or tech in general in Southeast Asia. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the issues surrounding tech are viewed almost predominantly, almost solely and exclusively through economic lens. And because conventional economic theory, and Mary, you know this much better than I do, treats environmental impacts and kind of the effects on labor as externalities, we treat them as such as well. So we don't fully factor in the costs of, what I talked about, kind of the full life cycle environmental impact of AI. There, again, going back to my point about techno-optimism, we hear a lot of stories and reports about how AI can be used to advance sustainable measures in agriculture, for example, which is really important. But how we measure the success of AI being deployed for agricultural purposes compared to its total environmental cost in building it and deploying it is another thing. And I had to look a little deeply into this to try to write a piece on the environmental impact of AI. And there's so many mathematical equations, how you measure the cost of environmental effects of AI is dependent on so many variables, right? But I think one of the persuasive arguments that I read about is that if a particular AI system is meant to mitigate some of the environmental effects of a particular method of agriculture, for example, then the building of the AI system should either equal whatever the environmental cost that system is being deployed for, or it should be much less than what is being deployed for, right? So the net effect or the net calculation should either be zero or less. And so it's not a simple equation, obviously, again, many variables for different systems, but these sorts of calculations, I don't think we've really thought about at the policy level. So again, strategies, frameworks, blueprints in Southeast Asia, we talk in general terms about sustainability and achieving the SDGs. But if conventional economic theory still holds that these are externalities, then are we really factoring in these costs at a meaningful scale?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are just so many questions, obviously. I mean, since you're here, I've got all these questions in mind. I would love to ask all of them to you, but we have limited time and you're recovering from the flu. So I mean, gotta keep it brief. But just as we already mentioned, the sort of growing role of actors such as China, for example, in this global climate governance. And that's one of the things that I'm now working on for a paper. I wanted to also get your view on what you see as potential like changing dynamics you may foresee if any of the countries in the region have a different take on China's evolving role. It's more kind of increasing maybe willingness to act as a leader despite all the issues that we are discussing regarding the way the economy is growing, obviously. Do you see divergence of views between countries in the case of Southeast Asia?
So again, because of the diversity of Southeast Asia, it depends on which Southeast Asian country you ask, right? But I think the general consensus is that some of the security challenges aside, the unavoidable fact is that China is the largest trading partner of all the 10 ASEAN member states, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And that is a fact that is a reality. It's a fact that's a reality, and we cannot run away from it. And we are geographically proximate to China. So whatever happens at the security level with the South China Sea dispute, for example, is one issue. But the larger issue is that China, as well as the other major powers, whether it's the United States or countries in the EU, even Australia further down south to us, I think they're seen as potential partners for our technological development. And the policies that have been meted out by China, by the EU in particular on areas such as data protection, I think are watched very, very closely and with interest by Southeast Asian countries. And it's not, as we are frequently told in the United States, a matter of choosing one side over the other. I think what we see with a lot of legislative frameworks in Southeast Asia is a mix and match kind of plug and play template that governments are following. The EU, of course, has been a front runner on many of these issues, data protection and privacy obviously being the most stark example. But we'll see with the AI Act, I suspect that that will be a standard setting measure that will be followed by some Southeast Asian countries as well. China, of course, has its laws, which actually make quite a lot of sense to many people in Southeast Asia because of its consumer protection goals. Now, whether or not there are other political aspirations and motivations, I think the Chinese government has projected this far quite an appeal of its laws. And so I think what we'll see in Southeast Asia is, again, this picking of models that will work for it best. And if Southeast Asian governments have to mix and match to form their own domestic legislative frameworks, then they will do that. There is no morally or ideologically superior model as we see it in Southeast Asia between the United States and China, despite what we are often told by Washington. And so this pragmatism, this focus on functionalism will be the driving force for many Southeast Asian countries on tech issues moving forward.
Thank you so much. I just couldn't stop the political scientist in me. I had to ask that question.
Of course, it's the only question that matters in Washington these days, as you know.
Right. Just maybe we can, I guess, I mean, as we're approaching the first half of the talk, and I promise our audience that we'll spare enough time to get questions from them. I wanted to maybe conclude with some more general questions. You already touched upon the role that you see for regional cooperation in Southeast Asia to address again the cross-border challenges of digitalization, such as data privacy and cybersecurity. How can Southeast Asian nations leverage their strategic position in the global tech supply chain to influence global tech governance? Is going to be my final general question, which you actually already again touched upon some of the issues I mentioned there, but maybe we can conclude with that and then open the floor for a Q&A.
So I think you see more of an active role by some Southeast Asian governments that are key nodes in the global semiconductor supply chain. So countries like Malaysia, Vietnam have profited from the whole semiconductor friendshoring debacle in the last few months that we've seen. So the United States has decided that it wants to reshore a lot of its production capabilities and capacities back to the United States, but it also has this friendshoring approach. And so situating some of its production capacities in countries that it deems friendly to it, including, strangely enough, Vietnam, despite its differences in political ideologies and governance structures. So these countries, Malaysia in particular, has profited quite a bit and leveraged from the whole US-China competition in the semiconductor space, but only in a certain sector of the semiconductor production space, particularly assembly, packaging, and testing. And so what Malaysia has done is to try to leverage that even further with the United States CHIPS Act. So with reshoring incentives that are being thrown around to US businesses, Malaysia has decided that it could potentially support those reshoring capabilities even more in assembly, packaging, and testing. The question is, for a country like Malaysia and other countries in Southeast Asia that are looking to leverage this US-China competition, including countries like Indonesia, like Thailand, and the Philippines, whether stopping this gap is enough for now. And I don't think it is. Okay, you might benefit in the next 10, 15 years, maybe, with this semiconductor diversification approach. But what if there is a change in policy, either from the United States, which is entirely possible, as we saw with the Trump administration, with certain international agreements, and we have the US elections coming up, or there could be a change in policy or strategy from China or anywhere else. Or we could have a pandemic, right? And then what happens to this approach by Southeast Asian countries of kind of exploiting, if you will, making the most of these tensions? And for me, the longer game that needs to be played is, as you alluded to, Mary, to try to change the standards around tech at the policy level, at the international legal level, but also at the governance level. So it's not enough to just be the stopgap region. We need to be more innovative in how we think about policies related to tech, because we often sell ourselves as a market full of users and consumers. We are suppliers of resources. We assist and support in the production capacities, and we are users and consumers. Why aren't we selling ourselves as producers of ideas, of standards, of regulations, of governance? And we haven't taken that in Southeast Asia further than, hey, come to us, we're a market, and we are a resource for you.
Thank you so much. Everything you said is so thought-provoking. So I'll open the floor for questions. With, of course, the caveat that we cannot take forever today. We planned it to be an hour talk, but I mean, if you could cut it shorter, we'll do that because again, we really appreciate you joining us despite recovering from cold. There's one question, I'll read it out loud for those of you who are watching this recording not synchronously. So Romina is asking one quick question, and I apologize if it's slightly beyond the scope here. Drawing from the question about China's role in global climate governance and the relationship between China and countries in Southeast Asia, I was curious about how the human rights situation in China has impacted, if at all, the relations between these countries and China. Thank you so much for this. Shall I read the next question, or would you like to? Okay, let me read the next so we can decide like how much time we can spare for the answers. Zishan's asking, thank you for these valuable information. Actually, I would like to better understand and follow the developments of technology and digitalization in this region. What external or internal sources or books would you recommend? Where should we start to learn more about it? I do have some students who are taking my international development course here, so you may be getting questions of that nature. Maybe we can start with these two and then we can take it from there.
Sure. I think on the question about China's human rights, if the question is indirectly alluding to kind of the Uyghur situation, I think there have been different approaches by different countries in Southeast Asia. So the Muslim majority countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, even between Malaysia and Indonesia, we have been a little different in our approaches. So a lot of the concerns have not been publicized, and I know that there have been outreach campaigns by the Chinese to assure countries like Indonesia and Malaysia that there isn't cause for concern with what's going on in Xinjiang. And they have brought politicians, they've brought community leaders to Xinjiang to take a look for themselves. Now, in Malaysia's case, the government has quietly in the past rejected requests from Beijing to return some of the Uyghurs who are in the country or were in the country. And the government did this quietly because it didn't want to create an international diplomatic incident or a huge outcry. These were reported in the media, but again, in a very muted way. So there have been some instances of pushback, a quiet pushback, but in general, Southeast Asian countries and China have been really good at segmenting rather than linking human rights issues to political or economic relations between both sides. And I think it's worked out for now. Whether it's a sustainable approach or strategy in the long run depends quite a bit on what happens with human rights situations in both China and in certain countries. Particularly when you think about some of the surveillance technologies that are being imported by Southeast Asian countries, not just from China, but also from European countries and the United States.
Thank you so much. And I've just noticed I actually missed a question, so I'll read that. But my students know that I don't see that well. I'm also in the classroom. I tend to miss their hands sometimes, so sorry about that. Zainab's asking, since we talked about semiconductor chips, I wonder your thoughts about electric vehicles. Do you believe they represent a truly sustainable solution for transportation, or are there underlying issues with their production and energy consumption that might undermine their environmental benefits?
So
Maybe
Mary,
we can answer this one.
I also realized I didn't answer Zishan's question. So
I'm sorry.
that makes no fault on both of us. So I'm sorry about that, Zishan. So let me try to, I'm always a bit wary about recommending resources, but I think a good place to start is with primary sources. So they're very dry, they're very boring, but if you have the time and interest, I think a good place to start would be with the government documents on, whether it's AI or digitalization in general. And almost all countries in Southeast Asia, barring maybe Myanmar at this point because of the situation raging there, have some sort of strategy that is related to technological development. And at least 5 out of 10 countries have AI guidelines that are being developed. From there, I think you can make your own assessments about where they stand. But I'm a huge fan also of this academic at the LSE called Jason Hickel. And he talks about basically the entrenched global injustices because of global economic structures. And so when you think about kind of the technological policies that are being framed in Southeast Asia and that are premised on economics, I think an outlook like Jason Hickel's would benefit, certainly has benefit my perspectives. Okay, so now to Zainab's question on semiconductor chips and EVs. So again, there are countries like Indonesia and the Philippines which have been marketing their resource capacities, particularly in nickel for the production of EV lithium batteries. My understanding is that a lot of the, or not a lot, but some of the EV manufacturers like Tesla are beginning to change the composition of the chemical composition of their EV batteries so that they are no longer lithium dependent. And instead, it's going to be more, I want to say salt-based, like natrium. I'm obviously not a chemist, but essentially they're changing the chemical composition to reduce dependence on lithium and therefore nickel as the raw material. Now, if there are countries like Indonesia and the Philippines that are saying, come to us, we have these nickel deposits, and one of the largest nickel deposits in the world, what does that mean in the next 10, 50 years for these countries when the resources have been extracted and processed in a very, very unsustainable and unenvironmentally friendly way, leaving all sorts of scars on the planet, as well as on the health and livelihoods and safety of the local populations around where those extraction activities will have taken. And I think, this is obviously a politically sensitive topic in these countries, particularly as elections gear up in Indonesia. But there are concerns that have been raised by activists and civil society organizations about whether being a part of the greener tech supply chain is really environmentally sustainable in a significant and meaningful way.
Thank you so much. We have a few more questions, so I'll try to summarize some of them and keep it brief. Mira is asking, as a question about the status of Malaysia as a developing country, as it has this aim of becoming a developed country, according to Mira's little research. She's asking if it is moving in the right direction in terms of improvements for development. Another question that was sent to me directly, you probably are not seeing that one, is by Berkay. What is the World Bank aid strategies between Southeast Asian countries, especially China's strategies over other countries for digital investments and developments? And there is one last question. So I'm just like gathering all these, so you get to decide what details you can speak about as we have about 50 minutes left. Mehmet Atol is asking, in the context of AI and discrimination, I believe it is observable that the old terminology of developmental state and embedded autonomy are changing. Nowadays, developmental and predatory state models can coexist in the same government with help of modern governance and AI. It's very clear that my students are doing their homework with all these terms that you can see. So here he's asking, do you think we need a new terminology with this neutral state? Also, do you think this will spill over around Southeast to East Asia?
So many interesting questions. Mary, you have some really bright students. I'm going to try to get to them. So I think on the question regarding the World Bank, I'm very sorry. I don't really follow World Bank policies closely, and so I can't provide any more details than to say that it's your conventional developmental approaches, grow the economy, grow jobs, grow the GDP, which I don't know, maybe I'm a little more radical in thought that way. I think economic growth is good, but at the end of the day, you have to ask what it's for, particularly against the backdrop of a climate crisis and an urgent one. And it's not like this climate crisis is far from Southeast Asia. We're seeing direct impacts in the region as well. But when I watch media, mainstream media in Southeast Asia, even like on social media, there is a very little connection cognitively that is being drawn between the climate crisis and our economic policies. And so I think, and maybe I'm a little harsh in criticizing the policies in the region this way, but I feel that we haven't really taken into account on any comprehensive scale what it means to be growing the economy and being a part of this quote unquote sustainable production value chain for EVs or whatever else that's supposed to be more sustainable in any holistic way. And it's mainly been a single track look at how we develop our economies, which kind of gets to, I think, Mirai's question about Malaysia. So in the past, we had what is called Vision 2020. And that was actually quite a comprehensive outlook on how Malaysia should develop in its own modes, taking into account socio and cultural variances, and basically being our own developed state according to how we as Malaysians want it. So not necessarily modeling ourselves on any particular country or region. Do I think it's moving in the right direction? I think it's stagnated. There have been a few updated iterations of Vision 2020 since, but because of our domestic political situation, which has been a little unpredictable and unstable over the last 3 to 4 years, actually maybe even 5, we haven't really been able to focus on achieving some of those. I think we haven't achieved whatever we laid out in Vision 2020, and that's why there were updated iterations and versions. Unfortunately, I don't think we've been very creative in our thinking of what a developed country looks like now against the backdrop of the climate crisis. So we talk about it, but we haven't really put any action or really any intellectual reflection to it in a way that at least would satisfy me. I think it's been a superficial kind of consideration thus far. What improvements I think can be made? I think we need to look at what we call, Mary and I call global majority countries. So we've looked at the development templates of the West, of Europe and the United States. I think it's served us well so far. Many of the countries in Southeast Asia have been independent for less than a century, maybe half a century. Is the kind of the average, with some of the newer nations like Cambodia and all, even less. And they've come out of conflict situations, very traumatic experiences. Why is it that we're not looking to our partners in Latin America, in Africa, to learn from their experiences? And we may have more in common with them than we do with Europe or the United States that we're aware of. So I think we should broaden our horizons in order to improve our conceptualization of development. Okay, Mehmet's question. I'm sorry, I haven't been sitting in Mary's classes, so I'm not very familiar with some of these terms, but I think to me, I take a lot of these terms with a huge grain of salt. Essentially, I'm going to try to answer your question because I don't know what these terms mean, I'm being honest. So I don't think we can be neutral states anymore. And this, you've heard this refrain from Southeast Asian leaders that we don't want to be forced into a choice. The reality is that choices are being made every single day, whether it's with tech decisions or whether it's with economic decisions. For example, 5G a few years ago, there were some behind the scenes pressures about which 5G vendor to choose. And decisions were made in Singapore, in Malaysia, in the Philippines. In Malaysia in particular, that decision has been reviewed. So we went with Ericsson, and then very recently, the Malaysian Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, who's actually a good friend of Turkey, has decided that you know what, we're going to allow Huawei to also be a 5G provider. I don't know how this dual track 5G vendor system is going to work in practice, but that was what was announced. And so, like I said, even with submarine cables as the backbone of digital infrastructure, there are hard decisions that are being made and that are going to have to be made as some of these geopolitical pressures come into play, with decisions forced upon some of these countries at both the public and private sector levels. What else did I miss, Mary?
You didn't miss anything, actually. Thank you so very much for this really interesting talk. We all enjoyed very much. And I also would like to thank our audience for the lively debate we had. And I hope those who are listening to the recording of the session will get to enjoy that as much as we did. Any final words, Elina? Or shall we say, see you later, hopefully in person next time?
No, I just want to encourage us all, myself included, and this is a reminder to myself, to really think a little more broadly and to read more widely about some of these developmental approaches and what it means, because it's not business as usual anymore. The pandemic has taught us that we cannot do business as usual, and it's not normal anymore. And we have this looming urgent climate crisis ahead of us, that we need to situate all our decisions against that backdrop. It's no longer enough to completely separate the two. And for that reason, I would encourage us to look away and maybe apart from the usual developmental models to look at some of our partners in the global majority world. But I also want to thank you, Mary, so very, very much for giving me this soapbox to preach my radical ideas to. And I hope it's been of some use to the audience.
No,